we are going to continue Forms Monday into the new training calendar. So I know the new training calendar is not out. We run out of trainings this week. This is the end of the existing training calendar. We aren't going to have any trainings, official trainings next week because it's the end of the month and it's the week after Easter. But at 10 a.m. on Friday the 5th, I will be in town, address to be determined. We will be doing an in-person AVID agent visual inspection training. Again, address to be determined. And I'm going to play around with Cuba Casa. So we might talk about that a little bit too while we're doing the AVID training. If you're like, Amy, I don't know what Cuba Casa is, that's a good reason for you to show up to that training. And then I think after the AVID training, in the afternoon, I'm going to pop back over to the office, and I think we're going to revisit our goals because we're opening up the second quarter. Now's a good time to really dig in to where we're at with our goals, kind of take inventory and put a plan together for the next 12-week period or the next quarter. So we're going to be talking about that in the office in the afternoon, probably at 1 o'clock, but I haven't solidified that. So stay tuned for that. So we have some trainings next Friday. Then the next week, we'll have regular forms on Monday at 11. Tuesday, there won't be a training because I am traveling on Tuesday. And then the new schedule will come out for Wednesday. So stay tuned for some exciting things. We're going to change Tech Wednesdays. You know how we normally do Wednesday evenings? We do hands-on tech. We're going to be doing those lead gen. So we'll be talking about different lead gen opportunities, open houses, sphere of influence, leads from listings, business to business, every Wednesday night at 7 o'clock. We're still going to have our guest speakers on Wednesday morning at 11. We'll have our Rev Up series on Tuesdays. And then Mondays will still be forms. But we're going to dive into the listing agreement on Mondays, starting in April, and going through all the forms that are kind of associated with that. We are going to kick off though with the training that I skipped a couple weeks ago that had the, I think it was contingent, the COP maybe. There was like 3 forms that I skipped. So we'll kick off with that. See if the schedule is right done for next week or the week after. That second week of April. And then we're also going to dive in that next week. We're going to be talking about the cooperating broker compensation agreement, which is going to become so much more important. We're going to do the cooperating broker compensation agreement and the confirmation of commission, because it looks like they're going to move to a point where the cooperating broker compensation is not going to be listed in the MLS. We're going to need, when we submit offers, to confirm the compensation that's being offered by the seller, if any. So stay tuned for those. Those are all coming up in the next quarter, but let's dive in today. Today we have, which I think is really funny and ironic, because last week we had a couple of questions about buyers and options and, how do we facilitate the, you got a seller that's selling a property that's also buying another one, and we're supposed to give up keys on the close of escrow. We're supposed to get keys on the close of escrow. And what if there's a hiccup, or how do we facilitate this overlap? The number one way to facilitate that overlap, number one, is to negotiate in a seller in possession after the close of escrow, which we already talked about that form. And that allows your seller, 1 to 3 days after the close of escrow to remain in the property that they're selling while they get their things moved out and moved into the next home. The other option to help facilitate that, if we don't want to stay in possession after the close, is our new residential purchase agreement. The default for possession is upon notice of recording, which means that could be at like 9 a.m. in the morning. It could be at 1 p.m. in the afternoon. It could be at 3 p.m. in the afternoon. There's kind of a wide array of times that we could get that confirmation of recording from the title company, which would be the moment that the seller is supposed to be out and handing keys over to the buyer. Okay, so if we have 2 transactions going on, or there's a tight kind of time frame at the end of this transaction, one of the other ways to do that is to, on your residential purchase agreement, when we're writing the offer, is to see, every week I say I should have the residential purchase agreement in the file already so I can pull it up. And every week I fail to do that. So maybe next quarter I'll be better at that. I should just make myself a little note on my computer screen. So On the residential purchase agreement, when you're writing the offer, if we scroll down, I'm just waiting for my computer to decide that it wants to participate in this process. My car forms library has frozen. There we go. All right. In the grid of that, it talks about when possession is going to be given. So again, if we've got some overlap going on, the default is notice of recordation. We could change that to 6 p.m. or 10 p.m. or 3 p.m. So we could specify a time there. You can either go 6 p.m. by checking this box, or over here, you could say, hey, we're going to be out by 10 p.m. on the date specified for the close of escrow. So just some things to pay attention to. You do have some options there for when you've got somebody selling a property and purchasing another property to give up that possession. And keep in mind, most of the time the buyer's writing this offer, so you can let the buyer's agent know before they write the offer that the seller wants until the end of the day on the close of escrow to be out of the property, or this is something that you could counter them on, but you're going to find it in this part of the grid. So so we don't have to ask for a seller in possession. We could just ask for more time on the close of escrow to facilitate that that seller getting out of that property and getting keys to the new property. Okay. The other thing that we could specify is on the property that they're buying. Instead of leaving this at notice of recordation, we could say, hey, we want it at 9 a.m. on the date of the close of escrow. As long as we're set up to record, we want those keys early in the morning so that we can start that moving process and get out. So there's a couple of options there. More likely you're going to get countered on an early close of early possession, right? Before we have notice of recording, but oftentimes the buyers will be gracious and allow you that full day to get out for your sellers. So just some things to keep in mind. However, if that doesn't end up working, and maybe there's a delay that happens, right? Like the listing's moving towards the close of escrow, but there's a hiccup in the buyer transaction, or it looks like it's going to take an extra couple days to get that one closed and recorded on. The lender's dragging their feet. Something happened with the appraisal. You do have a couple of options. The seller's still going to have to go move in with family, or maybe live in a hotel potentially. But one of the first options that you have is the buyer pre-occupancy storage addendum. Okay, this addendum here specifically allows the buyer to be able to store their items in the property that they are purchasing before the close of escrow. Okay, buyer pre-occupancy storage addendum. This one does not allow the buyer to live in the property before the close of escrow, but it does allow them to move their belongings in. So this is an addendum to the purchase agreement, or it might be a counter offer or other. We're going to date it here. And this is going to be that date right in the upper top corner of the document in which you're referencing, the printed date, not the one that's signed. If the document that you're referencing does not have a date in the upper corner, like this buyer pre-occupancy storage addendum doesn't, then it would be on the date that they signed it. Okay, so whatever the date of the signature is. You're going to put in the property address here. You're going to put in the buyer's names and the seller's names there on those next lines. This zip forms is really not participating with this process today. It's really lagging. That's okay though. This is an addendum intended for short-term pre-occupancy storage by buyers of buyer's personal property, otherwise identified as personal property, on the property before the close of escrow. Buyer is granted a license to store personal property as defined below on the property prior to the close of escrow. Keep in mind, this is not giving them access to like clean the property or anything else, just store things there. Term. The commencement date of the license begins on blank or blank calendar days before the scheduled close of escrow. So this might be like, oh my gosh, our property closes on Wednesday. Looks like our purchase isn't going to close until Friday. So it's going to begin on the date that the buyer closes on their property, or maybe even the day before. Who knows? Give them an extra day to help get their stuff out of the property. Okay, so notice it took away my option to put in calendar days. We could also take that out, and then we could say, hey, it begins 5 calendar days before the scheduled close of escrow. So that counts weekends. If no time is filled in, license begins on the date of buyer and seller's mutual signing of this pre-occupancy storage addendum, the POSA. So keep in mind, if this is blank, then it begins on the date that all the parties have signed this form. Any questions so far up to section 2? All right, access. Buyer shall, sorry, I needed to make sure my volume was up. Buyer shall move in all items of personal property on the commencement date or blank, and shall have no right to access to the property to bring in or remove items from that date until the termination of the license. So this is saying, hey, we have the right to bring stuff in on that date and only that date, and they can't bring more things in or take things away from that date until the close of escrow. Okay, and shall have no right of access to the property to bring in or remove items from that date until the termination of the license. Okay, so this, and you could put here, let's see if it'll let you type something in, entire term. Okay, so you can, so right, so you could say on the commencement date, or you put entire term. So, right, so that would mean that they have access to the property to bring stuff over during the entire term of that agreement. Okay, or you could put a date there. Okay. Termination. License under the POSA shall terminate on the earlier of the close of escrow or cancellation of this agreement. Buyer has no right to store personal property beyond this term unless escrow has been extended by mutual agreement or a subsequent agreement for storage is agreed to in writing and signed by the buyer and seller prior to the end of such term. So we could do a addendum or a extension of time. We do an extension of time to extend the term of the buyer pre-occupancy storage addendum if necessary. Okay. Consideration, right? The seller may want the buyer to pay for the right to store their belongings. Buyer agrees to pay seller a pre-occupancy storage fee for the term specified in paragraph 2 of blank per day or blank. So you could do either a per diem or you could do a flat rate. If escrow is extended by mutual agreement, buyer shall pay additional consideration for pre-occupancy storage in the amount of blank per day. Okay, so this might be like, hey, we're giving you the ability to store things at $50 per day. And if we extend escrow, that's going to go up to $65 per day for the agreement to extend the escrow. Right? So you could fill something in there. Personal property. Personal property means typical household furnishings and clothing. If not otherwise specified, buyer shall provide seller a list of all items stored upon completion of the move-in. Right? Itemized list. How many boxes, couch, whatever it is that was put in that property, they should have an itemized list, just as if you were like loading it up in a large moving company's truck. If you have hired a moving company to move from one house to the other, the moving company probably already has an itemized list of everything they loaded onto that truck, how many boxes, how many couches, how many chairs, whatever it is. We can just get a copy of that once the stuff is moved in and hand that over to the seller. No storage of the following. Buyer shall not store any firearms, ammunition, or illegal, flammable, hazardous, explosive, corrosive, caustic, or other dangerous materials. Right? So basically, if it can go on a commercial moving truck, it's okay to store in the property for the most part. Storage area. Buyer is allowed to store buyer's personal property in the following locations on the property only. Where are they allowed to access to store those items? Can they move it into the property? Is it just going to be the garage? Oftentimes, sellers are okay with giving you garage access, but not full house access. Keep in mind that if something happens and this deal blows apart at the end, right? The loan blows apart, that buyer is going to have to go get all their stuff and get it out of there ASAP. So we want to be cautious at how much they allow them to move in prior to the close of escrow. Removal of personal property. If buyer has not completed the purchase of the property, buyer shall remove personal property within 3 calendar days of termination of this license. Buyer may be responsible for court-awarded damages if buyer does not remove personal property by the termination date without a subsequent written agreement. The storage of buyer's personal property on the property shall not be deemed as buyer taking possession or title under the Uniform Vendor and Purchaser Risk Act, except as otherwise specified. Buyer's personal property, including vehicles, is not insured by the seller and, if applicable, not by the homeowners association against loss or damage. Each party is to carry their own insurance to protect the respective property from such loss buyer is responsible for all damages incurred at either move in or move out or otherwise of the personal property, as well as any damage caused either at move in or move out or otherwise to seller's real or personal property. Your buyer, if they're moving stuff into a house before it's closed, they should probably contact their insurance agent and get some renter's insurance to cover their belongings in that property. Waiver. The waiver or breach shall not be construed as a continuing waiver or the same or subsequent breach. All other terms, conditions, and supplements go on item 13. Okay. Brokers do not recommend pre-occupancy storage. Brokers have advised buyer and seller to consult with a qualified California real estate attorney to determine whether entering into such an addendum temporarily or permanently changes the nature of their status as buyer and seller and to the legal consequences and implications of pre-occupancy storage. If buyer and seller agree to pre-occupancy, they are doing so against the advice of brokers and at their own risk. By signing below, buyer and seller acknowledge that each has read, understands, and received a copy of and agrees to the short-term or to the terms of this buyer pre-occupancy storage addendum, and all parties sign there. Okay. Generally speaking, the only way I allow this to happen on one of my listings and the only way that I'd ask for it for one of my buyers is I am like 99.9% sure this deal is going to close. And I know why it hasn't closed, or I know what the delay is. Oftentimes we don't do it until the buyers actually sign their final paperwork. We're just waiting for that recording and funding and recording to take place. But any questions about the buyer pre-occupancy storage addendum? All right. Fabulous. Thanks for the heads up or the thumbs up, Heather. I said heads up. Again, this is a great option for a buyer that needs to get out of their house for whatever reason. They're doing maybe their lease ended early, or they got a special deal if they were out before the end of the month and they're not supposed to close on the new home until the 4th. They don't want their stuff sitting around in a moving truck or renting a U-Haul for extra days. So there's all sorts of options that this could work for. Great option. It means they can now go sleep in a hotel room and not have to worry about their stuff being stolen out of a truck. Okay. The other option that we have, so this is the pre-occupancy storage addendum for just their stuff. We also have the option of the, hold on, the buyer early occupancy addendum, the BEO. Okay, buyer early occupancy addendum. This one is going to allow the buyer and their belongings to occupy the property before the close of escrow. Again, as with the last one, this is not our recommended action, but in a pinch, this could work. I've worked these out multiple times between buyers and sellers. It does serve a purpose. And again, I usually want to make sure on both sides that I'm pretty sure the buyer's transaction, like 99.99999% is going to close. There's just been a delay for some reason. And on the listing side of it, I want to make sure that buyer is going to close. Oftentimes, I wouldn't allow a buyer early occupancy until the buyer's docs are at title and they've signed them. Okay, I want to make sure that we're going to get to at least that point, because then we're just waiting on that funding and recording. I have seen transactions. I have not been a party to them, but I have seen transactions where the buyer was given early occupancy. They've moved into the property. All their stuff is at the property, and their loan gets denied at the last minute and they had to move out. Okay, that is not an ideal situation for anybody involved, and it's costly and painful. So just make sure it's a pretty done deal. This addendum to the purchase agreement or other, dated blank, right? So that's that date in the upper left-hand corner of the purchase agreement. On the property known as, put the full address there. Because I haven't said it yet today, make sure you put street, drive, court, road, whatever the suffix of that street is, because it might have the same address, might be a court as the same address on a street or a drive. So put the full address, buyer's names, seller's names, and buyer or seller are referred to as parties. This addendum is intended for short-term occupancy. So that would be 29 days or less by the buyer of a property before the close of escrow. If occupancy is intended to be for 30 days or longer, use the interim occupancy agreement. Okay, short term, we use the BEO. Longer term, we use the IOA. Amy, why might we have an IOA? I don't know, but maybe the seller is selling the property because they had to move, and maybe they're 3 months away from their 2-year mark in their property where they can be exempt from capital gains, right? So maybe they're like coming up on that mark and they're like, oh my gosh, like we want to sell the house. We've got to get it on the market. We're leaving town, but we can't close until this date. The buyer may say, hey, that's great. I'm willing to give you a longer escrow period, but I'd like to occupy the property before the close of escrow. I'll pay you rent for that time. And that way it makes it a win-win for all parties involved. So there might be something like that that gets worked out. Who knows what might be happening? There's so many options there. But for a term longer than 29 days, just like the SIP and the RLAS, we're going to use the IOA for 30 days or more. For the most part, this is going to be a 29-day or less thing. It really should be like a 2-day or less thing. Really should be not at all. But if it does, it should be short. Local rent control and other law regarding tenants' right may impact buyer and seller's rights and obligations. Any questions before we dive into section 1 of this form? All right. The term buyer is granted a possession of the property for blank calendar days before the close of escrow or blank. So, right. So we're either given those time frames 10 calendar days before the close of escrow, or we could put on like a specific date here. Buyer early occupancy addendum, the BEO shall terminate on the close of escrow of this agreement. Buyer has no right to remain in possession beyond this term unless escrow has been extended by mutual agreement or a subsequent agreement for possession is agreed to in writing and signed by the buyer and seller prior to the end of such term. Buyer may be responsible for court-awarded damages if buyer does remain beyond the termination date without a subsequent written agreement. Section 2 is consideration. Buyer agrees to pay seller an early possession fee for the term specified in one of blank dollars per day or a flat rate. So, right, so this is where we're going to say, hey, we're willing to pay $50 per day to occupy that property up until the close of escrow, or we're willing to pay, you know, $1,000 for the opportunity to occupy the property prior to the close of escrow. So, right, so it could be a flat rate or it could be a per diem. Okay, keep in mind that if the seller is paying, if the buyer is paying money to the seller for this early occupancy of the property or even the storage of that, number one, it should pass through escrow because all money that's part of the transaction should be passing through escrow. So number two, the buyer's lender needs to know about it. So we need to run this by the buyer's lender before we put this in play to make sure that the buyer's lender is okay with the buyer paying that money. Okay, the buyer's lender may say, hey, that's great, but please pay it outside of escrow because here we are on the tail end and we're trying to get this thing wrapped up and closed in the next 3 days. And if the buyer has to pay more money to the seller for this early occupancy, then I'm going to have to reissue that closing disclosure. It's going to be a mess. I'd rather not do that. So just have this happen outside the close of escrow. If the lender tells you to do that, do it. Okay, whatever the lender says goes. Otherwise, it should pass through escrow. Okay, per day or a flat rate, and to increase buyer's deposit by blank, in which case all parties shall execute a separate liquidated damage clause, CAR form DID, at the time entering into this BEO. So, right, so the buyers got a deposit in escrow already. Please make sure the buyers have removed all contingencies before doing a buyer interim occupancy agreement, okay, or an early occupancy agreement. They should have removed all their contingencies. If the buyer fails to close, the assumption is that that deposit is going to go to the seller. Okay, at this point, the buyer's in possession of their house, that's going to go. We can increase the buyer's deposit. So let's say the buyer's deposit was like at 1%, right? We got a purchase of $550,000. They've got $5,500 in escrow already as their deposit. We could increase it by another $3,000. We could increase it by another $1,000, right? This is, we're increasing the deposit, not a separate deposit. Okay, if we are increasing the deposit, okay, you don't have to do this. You could just leave it at 0, right? We don't have to put anything there. But if we do increase the deposit, you want to execute the DID form. Okay, which pulls that part of the deposit into the liquidated damage clause and makes it okay for the seller to go after that money if the buyers are in breach of the agreement. Okay, buyer shall deposit such funds with escrow holder immediately upon execution of this BEO if applicable DID. If escrow is extended by mutual agreement, buyer shall pay seller additional consideration for early occupancy in the amount of blank per day. So remember, we might say, hey, it's $1,000 for the original term, but if you have to extend escrow further, we're willing to do it, but it's going to cost you an extra $50 per day, right? So we might say, hey, you get 10 days before the close of escrow, you can occupy this property. Actually, I'm going to say like 5 days. You're gonna pay me $1,000 for those 5 days. And if you have to extend it further, it's an additional $50 per day. That's how this whole section works right here. Okay. At close of escrow, the increased deposit will be applied towards the purchase price. Okay. So that increased deposit goes towards the closing cost, the down payment, whatever it is the buyer has to come in with. It's the buyer's funds. Okay. Buyer agrees to pay for all utilities and services and the following charges, right? Buyer is going to take responsibility for turning on the utilities and stuff while they're in the house. Entry, buyer shall make property available to seller for the purpose of entering to make necessary or agreed to repairs or to supply necessary or agreed services. Buyer and seller agree that 24-hour notice, oral or written, shall be reasonable and sufficient notice. In an emergency, seller may enter the property at any time without prior notice, right? Just regular tenant rights. Maintenance and alterations. Buyer shall maintain the property, including pool, spa, landscaping, and grounds, and all seller's personal property included in the sale in substantially the same condition as on the date of this BEO. Except as provided in this agreement, buyer shall not make any alterations to the property without seller's prior written consent. So if the buyer has plans to rip out all the carpet and replace it when they occupy that house, they cannot do that until the close of escrow happens, until they actually own the house. What would be worse than the buyer moving in the property, ripping out all the carpet, and then their loan fails to close? Now, not only do they have to move out, but they owe the seller new carpet. Bad idea. So no alterations to be done to the property until that close of escrow. Okay, buyer's also maintaining the property, so it's got to be in the same condition as when the sellers were supposed to have delivered it to the buyer. And when it talks about personal property, that'd be like if the sellers included a fridge in the sale of the home, the buyers should keep that fridge in working order until the close of escrow. Assignment and subletting. Buyer shall not assign or sublet all or any part of the property or assign or transfer the right to occupy the property. Any assignment, subletting, or transfer of the property by voluntary act of buyer, by operation of law or otherwise without seller's prior written consent, shall give the seller the immediate right to terminate the buyer's right to possession. Okay, don't assign or sublet. Insurance, except as otherwise specified, buyer's personal property, including vehicles, and seller's personal and real property is not insured by the other party and, if applicable, not by the homeowners association against loss or damage. Each party is to carry their own insurance to protect their respective property from such loss. Prior to occupancy, buyer shall obtain renter's insurance with liability coverage, naming the seller as an additional insured. Seller shall consult with existing insurance carrier or insurance broker to determine the effect on the existing policy if buyer is permitted to occupy before the close of escrow. Seller is advised not to let buyer commence early occupation until seller has both received and reviewed a copy of the buyer's insurance and consulted with the seller's insurance advisor. For the most part, right, we're now allowing somebody else to occupy our property. Our insurance carrier may want to, as the seller, may want to turn that into a landlord policy instead of a homeowner's policy. Okay, so just kind of keep that in mind. Know too that if it rolls, like people get really scared of like landlord policies because they're like, oh my gosh, my insurance is already is expensive enough. Just so you know, when it usually rolls to a landlord policy, it actually gets cheaper because we're now no longer insuring the contents of the home. We're just insuring the home itself. So the insurance usually goes down, moving it to a landlord policy from a homeowner's policy. Okay. The waiver of any breach shall not be construed as a continuing waiver of the same or subsequent breach. Other terms, conditions, and supplements. Okay, you got some lines there to fill in our blanks because we all like our blanks. Brokers do not recommend early occupancy. Broker has advised buyer and seller to consult a qualified California real estate attorney to determine whether entering into such an addendum temporarily or permanently changes the nature of their status as buyer and seller and the legal consequences and implications of an early occupancy. If the buyer and seller agree to the early occupancy, they are doing so against the advice of the broker and at their own risk. By signing below, each acknowledges that they have read, understand, and received a copy and agrees to the terms of this BEO. Questions on the BEO, the buyer early occupancy addendum, or the buyer storage addendum, the POSA, pre-occupancy storage addendum? No, everybody's good.
Amy just wanted to say hi, and my listing appointment just went an hour over longer expected. I wish I would have saw this one.
Well, it's recorded, so that's good. So you'll get it. You can
Yeah.
rewatch it.
Okay.
Did you get the listing?
I have the listing sort of. We're stuck on the whole new lawsuit
Commission.
though. She doesn't want to sign because of the lawsuit. So I have to figure out how I'm gonna address that.
Okay. Is she reluctant to pay commission to the buyer's agent or just?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
And the reason why is because she's not, she's in her late 80s and she's not ever buying again. So she's moving to a rental in another city. So she's like, why should I? There's a lawsuit that says I don't have to.
There is a lawsuit that says
I'll find out, get back to you.
You're like, and that may limit your buyer pool.
Right. So I go, are we going to be the first people in your area to do this? Or are we going to, but I kind of get, you know, if she, I'm sorry, I'm taking up your class.
No, you're good. I was done. So take it up.
She, you know, she doesn't have any more money after this. This is the last of her cash influx. And she said, if I can save that money, it will make a lifetime of difference to her. So I don't know what to do. I said, I'll get back to you.
Yeah, and you could always, you know, advise her that we can put the listing on with no commission being offered to the buyer's agent, but that a buyer's agent may try to negotiate that as part of the transaction, and that we'll cross that bridge when we get there. That it may make a difference between her getting a buyer and not having a buyer at that point.
Right. And she said, I think that's how she feels. She's a retired school teacher, and she goes, I think everybody should pay their own bills. Okay, good. Yeah. Anyway, that whole storage thing, that's, you know, definitely something that I'll go back and watch the video.
Yeah.
Because I'm in the middle of that also.
Perfect. And I thought it was ironic because you had asked me questions about it last week, and then this was on the schedule for this week. I go, oh, I should have looked at the schedule sooner because I didn't remember what that was.
My appointment was in Dixon at 9:30 and I just left because, you know, 80-something-year-old women don't have friends to come and visit. And I left without a signature.
It's all right. You'll get there.
I said, just tell all your friends and anybody that asks you, you have signed with an agent, please. I don't want somebody coming in swooping. Right, yeah. Right. Okay. Well, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. Any other questions on the BEO or the POSA forms? All right, fabulous. Next, that's all I've got for you today. I'm going to give you 20 minutes of your day back. Next week, again, no classes next week. You can log your attendance into the chat box while I tell you what's coming up again in case you missed it at the beginning. No classes next week until Friday. Friday at 10 a.m. I will be in person doing an AVID training, an agent visual inspection disclosure. I'm going to show you how to do it on Glide and what to look for when doing your AVID. Location to be announced. And then in the afternoon, I think at 1 o'clock, I'll make a decision on that in the next 48 hours. We'll be back in the office talking about, and we'll probably be on Zoom too, because I am, you know, I have a heart for the people in Zoom land. We will be talking about reviewing where you're at. So looking at your numbers and talking about how to get you through these next 12 weeks to help you meet your goals by the end of the year. So we'll be talking about that 12-week year system. And then on Monday, we have, we'll resume our trainings of forms at 11 o'clock. And then Tuesday, no training. And then next Wednesday, I think, I don't know what's next Wednesday. There's something. Let's see here. Let me tell you what is next Wednesday. That's the calendar. Hold on. I can't, why is this so hidden? I was just working on this. All right. Friday in-person Avid at 12-week year. Monday we'll be doing the COP, which is the contingency for sale of the buyer's property. Cancellation of contract and verification of property condition, which wraps up our forms related to our buyers. So those are the ones that I skipped last time. That will also be in person and on Zoom. So keep that in mind because I'll still be in town on Monday. Tuesday, no class. Oh, Wednesday, we don't have a schedule yet. So stay tuned for that. And then, no, Wednesday is the office meeting. So Wednesday, the 10th is office meeting. No class on Wednesday. So no class Tuesday, no class Wednesday, and we'll cover forms on Monday, the 8th. So no classes next week until Friday. We will see you all tomorrow for tomorrow we have creating clients for life. We're going to talk about the follow-up after a transaction, using our database appropriately, plugging them in, what that should look like after we close the transaction. Wednesday morning at 11, we have Brick House Mortgage with Beyond the Basics, learning about conforming and non-QM loans. And then no class on Wednesday, the 27th at night, because we're heading into Easter. And I have a feeling a lot of people are going to be out of town or occupied with children that have probably been home all week from school. So good luck to you, parents. So I will see you tomorrow. We'll be talking about clients, creating clients for life at 11 a.m. Thanks, everyone. You're welcome, Deborah.
Amy, you said 11 tomorrow?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely.